3 weeks after Richard stopped breathing, the oak grandfather clock in our hallway still ticked with a cruel rhythmic indifference. I didn't cry when I walked into Arthur Pendleton's law office that Thursday afternoon. For 40 years, my hands had carefully preserved the fragile, yellowed manuscripts of the City History Museum. As a senior archivist, my entire life was spent looking past surface appearances, peering through magnifying glasses to uncover the hidden watermarks, the erased ink, the deceitful corrections scribbled in the margins of history. At 65, I knew how people tried to rewrite their own narratives when they thought nobody was paying attention. Arthur's office smelled of aged leather, rain-drenched wool, and the faint, bitter trace of espresso. The mahogany table between us felt too wide, echoing the vast, sudden emptiness of our home since Richard's heart finally surrendered. Then the frosted glass door clicked open, and my daughter Chloe walked in. At 32, her shoulders carried a permanent, fragile tension, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. Right behind her stepped Julian. At 38, my son-in-law wore a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than my first 2 years of teaching combined. He carried himself with the slick, predatory posture of an investment fund manager who treated human lives like quarterly spreadsheets, always calculating yield, always waiting for the exact moment to execute a hostile takeover. He offered me a firm, lingering handshake that lasted a fraction of a second too long, not a gesture of comfort, but a silent assertion of dominance. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, his expression as neutral as a granite monument, and opened a thick, midnight blue leather binder. Most people in our quiet suburban neighborhood thought Richard and I were comfortable retirees living on a modest pension. They didn't know that 40 years ago, long before we married, Richard had inherited a quiet stake in early tech logistics and silent real estate holdings that quietly compounded in the dark corners of the market. Let us review the primary estate. Arthur's voice cut cleanly through the stale office air. Total verified valuation, liquidated and secured, $120 million. Chloe gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, tears instantly blurring her eyes. Julian didn't gasp. His jaw tightened just a fraction, and a sharp, calculating gleam flashed deep within his pupils, the look of a beast suddenly catching the scent of fresh blood in the woods. Arthur turned the crisp pages deliberately. To our beloved daughter Chloe, Richard leaves an unencumbered commercial real estate parcel valued at $8 million, alongside his personal collection of mid-century oil paintings. To his wife of 42 years, Eleanor, he leaves our family residence, his personal effects, and $5 million in liquid reserves. Out of $120 million, $3 million, wait, $5 million. $5 million was a staggering sum, a number so large it belonged in a textbook rather than my bank account. Yet, sitting aside an empire of that scale, it felt dangerously like an afterthought, a modest allowance left behind for an aging widow who was expected to smile, step aside, and fade quietly into the background. I glanced across the table. Julian wasn't even trying to hide his triumph anymore. His lips twitched upward into a thin, triumphant smirk, his shoulders relaxing against the leather backrest as his mind raced ahead, instantly consolidating the math. With Chloe receiving $8 million directly and my modest $5 million tucked safely away in my name, the remaining bulk of the fortune, $107 million, sat completely unattached in a primary trust. In Julian's eyes, a naive wife meant total, uncontested control for the husband pulling her strings from behind the bedroom door. He was already spending the interest. Arthur paused. He slowly removed his spectacles, folded them with agonizing slowness, and looked past Chloe, locking his eyes directly onto Julian's triumphant face. And the remaining $107 million, Arthur continued, his voice dropping into a heavy, deliberate register. is to be held in an irrevocable legacy trust. Management authority, executive oversight, and absolute discretionary distribution power are vested solely in the primary trustee, Eleanor Vance. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. For a single heartbeat, the world stopped turning. Then the chair behind Julian screeched violently against the hardwood floor as he vaulted to his feet, his face draining of color before flushing a furious mottled crimson. "This is an absolute absurdity," Julian's voice cracked, losing its boardroom polish entirely, revealing the desperate, snarling panic underneath. Eleanor is 65 years old. She spent her entire life sorting dusty papers in a basement museum. She doesn't know the first thing about venture capital, liquidity indexes, or modern financial architecture. This has to be an administrative mistake. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I simply watched him unravel, piece by piece, exactly as a fragile artifact shatters under sudden, excessive heat. Arthur didn't blink. He closed the blue binder with a definitive, echoing snap. "There is no mistake, Julian. Richard's instructions were absolute. He stated explicitly that his wife's lifetime of patience, sharp observation, and unshakable integrity made her the only person on earth qualified to guard what he built." Julian slammed his palms flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward until his face contorted with unchecked fury. "You're old, Eleanor," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom and utter contempt, completely forgetting the frightened wife sitting right beside him. And as for me, I looked at the man shouting across the table, and for the first time since Richard's heart stopped, I felt a cold, sharp spark of absolute clarity ignite deep within my chest. The heavy mahogany front door of my house clicked shut, locking out the suffocating echoes of Julian's condescending voice and Chloe's anxious silence. I had politely but firmly declined Julian's uninvited offer to stay over and help me sort things out. They wanted me disoriented, feeling fragile within these walls. Instead, I stood alone in the quiet hallway, listening to the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Richard was gone, but the methodical, sharp instincts of a woman who had spent 4 decades handling fragile, history-defining artifacts did not die with him. My mind flashed back to the final, handwritten note Richard had slipped into my desk drawer just days before his heart failed. A brief, urgent warning telling me to check the mother-of-pearl jewelry box in our bedroom. Ascending the stairs, the silence of the house felt less like emptiness now and more like a tactical pause before a storm. In our bedroom, resting atop the mahogany vanity, sat the antique jewelry box Richard had gifted me on our 10th anniversary. For 32 years, I had treated it as a simple receptacle for silver earrings and heirloom brooches. I never imagined it was a vault. I carried it over to the well-lit reading desk, pulled up my grandmother's adjustable magnifying lamp, and examined the intricate mother-of-pearl inlay along the rear panel. A lesser eye would have seen only decorative floral patterns, but my hands, trained by decades of inspecting hidden seams in antique manuscripts and evaluating dual-layered 19th-century oil canvases, immediately sensed a microscopic discrepancy in the wood's grain. Pressing my thumb against the third ivory petal on the left leaf while sliding the base plate upward, I heard a faint, satisfying click. A concealed false bottom slid open with effortless precision. Inside lay 6 thick manila archival folders, arranged chronologically with crisp white adhesive labels. The earliest date stamped on the tab was exactly 3 years and 2 months ago, right after Chloe and Julian's lavish high society wedding. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady as I opened the first file. The contents felt like a physical blow. What unfolded before my eyes was not a collection of personal letters, but a meticulously compiled dossier detailing a calculated multi-year predatory infiltration. Richard and I had always welcomed Julian into our home with open arms, believing he genuinely cherished our daughter. Page after page of transcripts, printed emails, and secretly captured digital photographs proved otherwise. The documents revealed that long before the wedding, Julian had systematically tracked our quiet lifestyle, mapping out our private holdings, and calculating the exact compound interest of Richard's early shipping and technology investments. I turned the page, my fingers brushing against printed logs of family dinners from 2 years back. There were notes detailing how Julian subtly steered table conversations toward real estate valuations, retirement timelines, and life insurance policies. Whenever Chloe stepped away to answer her phone or clear the plates, Julian had spent those moments photographing financial statements left near the desk or probing us with innocent-sounding questions about whether our assets were protected under an individual or shared trust. The fourth and fifth folders exposed an even darker reality. Julian hadn't just been gathering intelligence on our wealth, he had actively conspired to undermine us from within. The files contained records of secret meetings between Julian and junior partners at external wealth management firms, where he had pitched unauthorized strategies to redirect our liquidity. More chillingly, there were handwritten diagnostic notes and printed psychiatric articles concerning late-stage cognitive aging, memory loss, and legal incompetence in senior citizens. Julian had been plotting a long-term psychological warfare campaign, planning to manufacture an artificial narrative of mental decline so that when the patriarch or matriarch passed, he could easily challenge the estate on grounds of diminished capacity. He had mapped out my husband's decline like a vulture tracking a wounded animal, and he had planned to do the exact same thing to me. For a brief second, grief threatened to swallow me whole, mingling with a sharp, burning fury. A mother's worst nightmare isn't just losing her husband, it is realizing that the man she welcomed into her family as a son was a predator, wearing a custom-tailored mask, slowly poisoning her daughter's world from the inside out. Yet, as I stared at the raw evidence of betrayal spread out beneath the magnifying lamp, the historian inside me took over. Despair was a luxury I could not afford. Panic would only play directly into Julian's hands. I did not weep, nor did I reach for the phone to scream at my daughter or confront my arrogant son-in-law. Instead, I carefully picked up a pair of white cotton archival gloves from my desk drawer, slipped them onto my hands, and began treating those incriminating documents with the exact same reverence and scientific precision I used for century-old state papers. I scanned every single page, backed up digital copies onto an encrypted flash drive, cross-referenced every transaction date, and stored the physical files inside a heavy, fireproof safe behind the study bookshelf. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes corporate game against a defenseless old woman who spent her life looking backward at dead history. He had no idea that history teaches us one vital lesson: those who fail to study the archives are destined to be destroyed by them. 2 days after my discovery of the archival files hidden within the jewelry box, my phone buzzed sharply against the kitchen counter. It was Julian, his tone on the line an oily, manufactured blend of familial warmth and urgent concern. He claimed he wanted us to clear the air over a quiet lunch away from the heavy, suffocating memories of the family home, suggesting the Metropolitan Business Club, an exclusive wood-paneled sanctuary downtown where venture capitalists and corporate executives went to broker quiet deals behind closed doors. I knew precisely why he chose that venue. It was a controlled environment, stuffy, imposing, and entirely isolated from anyone who might recognize me as an independent individual rather than a grieving, bewildered widow. He wanted me on his turf, surrounded by the heavy symbols of elite finance, where he could systematically wear down my defenses. I agreed to meet him at noon. When I arrived at the club's private dining room, Julian was already waiting at a corner table overlooking the gray, unforgiving city skyline. He stood up with theatrical politeness, pulling out my chair and draping my coat over the back with a practiced, performative grace. A crystal decanter of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon sat sweating on the white linen tablecloth, right alongside an expensive leather portfolio, packed with color-coded charts, financial projections, and liquidity graphs. Without wasting a single polite pleasantry, Julian launched into a smooth, patronizing monologue about protecting what Richard had built, claiming the markets were currently experiencing a catastrophic bloodbath of high inflation indexes and volatile tech shares. He leaned forward across the white linen, tapping his expensive fountain pen against a glossy spreadsheet that showed terrifying downward curves, plunging straight into financial ruin, arguing that a massive legacy trust sitting on $107 million in cash and legacy stock without aggressive management was pure financial suicide. He did not pause to let me speak, methodically chipping away at my dignity by reminding me that I had spent 40 years dusting old papers in museum basements, insisting that the modern financial world moved at lightning speed rather than the slow pace of history books, and warning that market fluctuations would chew me up and spit me out within 6 months if I attempted to manage the trust independently. I kept my hands folded neatly over my lap, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction to cultivate the exact picture of an aging, out-of-touch widow who felt completely cornered by complex numbers. I let him talk, nodding slowly every time he threw around intimidating financial jargon like liquidity ratios, asset reallocation, and risk-adjusted yields. While Julian smugly assumed his psychological pressure was breaking me down to dust, my mind was working with the cold, absolute precision of an archivist cataloging a fraudulent manuscript. I didn't care about his flashy charts or his rehearsed warnings. Instead, I quietly noted every specific projection he cited, every arbitrary timeline he pushed, and every calculated distortion he used to exaggerate market risks. I watched the subtle twitch of his fingers, the impatient tapping of his Rolex against the mahogany edge, and the absolute arrogance shining in his eyes whenever he believed he had successfully terrified me into submission. He truly thought I was a fragile relic ready to crumble. Finally, after 45 minutes of relentless, systematic intimidation, Julian slid a thick, multi-page document across the pristine tablecloth, right beside my untouched wineglass, containing a pre-drafted general power of attorney and trusteeship delegation agreement, whispering softly that transferring the operational authority of the Legacy Trust to him was an act of pure mercy designed to take all the heavy legal and financial burdens off my shoulders. The trap was fully laid, waiting for me to step directly into the jaws he had spent years greasing. I looked down at the cold signature line, then raised my eyes to meet his, letting a tiny, trembling smile touch the corners of my lips. Not a smile of surrender, but the polite, evasive smile of someone who was supposedly too slow to understand the magnitude of what was happening. I looked straight across the table and told him that while it was a very generous offer, something of this magnitude required careful thought, and I needed a little more time to review the clauses and pray over them before I put my signature anywhere.
Julian froze instantly. The triumphant, predatory smirk stiffened dead on his face, and the fountain pen he was already holding out for me hung awkwardly in mid-air as he faced a polite, unyielding roadblock he never anticipated. When he stammered in panic that time was a luxury the market didn't give us, I replied gently that even history takes time to write, sliding the portfolio back across the table with deliberate slowness. He pulled his hand back, swallowing hard as he forced his CEO smile back on his face, completely blind to the fact that every single word he had uttered at that table had just been logged into a memory that would never fade.
72 hours after I walked away from Julian's high-pressure lunch at the Metropolitan Business Club, the second phase of his calculated offensive arrived right at my front porch. It wasn't Julian who came to twist my arm this time. He was far too clever to risk a direct confrontation so soon after hitting a wall. Instead, he deployed the one weapon guaranteed to bypass every single defense I had built: my only daughter, Chloe. It was mid-morning when the doorbell chimed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed through the empty rooms of the house. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the sight of my child broke something fragile inside my chest. Chloe looked like a ghost of the vibrant young woman she used to be. Dark, bruised purple hollows shadowed her eyes, her skin was paper white, and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched the strap of her leather tote bag. Without waiting for a polite invitation, she stepped past me into the hallway, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, as if she had been running a desperate marathon against her own mind. She didn't embrace me, nor did she ask how I was holding up in the quiet aftermath of her father's passing. Instead, she immediately began pacing the length of the hardwood floor, wringing her hands together while the words poured out of her in a frantic, unbroken rush. She pleaded, she begged, and eventually tears broke over her eyelids, rolling down her cheeks as she urged me to sign the trusteeship papers. Julian was beside himself with worry, she sobbed, because he genuinely believed the deep trauma of losing Richard, combined with my advanced age, was triggering severe cognitive decline, sudden memory slips, and dangerous isolation. I did not raise my voice, nor did I meet her panic with anger or defensiveness. That would have only played directly into the narrative Julian had carefully scripted for her to believe. Instead, I closed the front door, walked over to the weeping young woman, and gently took her cold, shaking hands between my own palms. I pulled her down to sit beside me on the velvet entryway bench, looking deep into her bloodshot eyes, trying desperately to find the bright, independent spirit of the daughter I had raised, hoping to anchor her back to reality before the psychological fog consumed her entirely. But as I searched her expression, a cold realization settled over my bones. The gaze looking back at me wasn't just anxious, it was hollow, conditioned, and thoroughly managed. Julian hadn't just worried about me, he had systematically gaslit my daughter for months, wearing down her sense of reality until she genuinely believed her own mother was losing her mind. She began repeating phrases that didn't belong to her vocabulary at all. As she tried to convince me to hand over the keys to the legacy trust, she stumbled over complex legal and corporate jargon, phrases like fiduciary exposure, asset liquidity reallocation, and probate vulnerability, terms Chloe never cared about or understood in her entire life. They were Julian's words, parroted through my daughter's lips like an automated recording. And then, in her heightened state of anxiety, she let slip something far more revealing, stammering through her tears that once the trust was unified under Julian's corporate advisory firm, they could finally secure the secondary payout on her own $8 million commercial parcel to fund an expansion project he had been quietly pushing her toward for months. She wasn't just advocating for my mental health, she was reciting a financial acquisition strategy that Julian had mapped out to drain our entire family lineage from the inside out, completely unaware that she had been turned into an unwitting pawn in her own husband's game. The air in the hallway grew heavy, thick with the suffocating realization of how deep the psychological manipulation ran. I watched her closely, feeling a deep wave of protective sorrow wash over me as I realized the battle wasn't just about money anymore. It was about saving my child from the cage her husband had built around her mind. Before I could utter a single word to break through the spell, a sharp, aggressive blast from a car horn tore through the quiet morning outside. Through the sheer lace curtains of the front window, a sleek, dark blue BMW sedan pulled aggressively into our driveway, crunching loudly over the gravel path. Two unfamiliar men stepped out from the passenger doors wearing tailored gray suits and carrying heavy leather briefcases, moving with practiced, cold efficiency of hired professionals. Behind them, stepping out from the driver's side with a triumphant, unmasked smirk, was Julian. They didn't pause to knock, nor did they wait for an invitation. They marched straight up our front steps, bypassed the porch, and pushed open the front door as if they already owned the roof over our heads. The heavy oak front door swung open with an assertive thud, and Julian marched into my hallway as if he already held the master deed to the estate. He wasn't alone. Flanking him like corporate mercenaries were two men whose crisp, expensive suits and chillingly detached expressions belonged in a glass-walled boardroom rather than a quiet family home. Julian stepped forward, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken relative forced by circumstance to take drastic action. He gestured grandly toward the two strangers, introducing them with a slippery veneer of professional concern. This, he announced to the silent room, was Dr. Marcus Brennan, a distinguished specialist in geriatric psychiatry, and right beside him stood Harrison Coleman, a senior attorney whose practice specialized in contested elder estates and guardianship litigation. The air in the hallway turned ice cold. Chloe stood frozen near the entryway bench, her eyes wide with shock and sudden shattering confusion, finally realizing the trap she had been manipulated into helping spring. She looked frantically between me and her husband, her breath catching in her throat as the true ugly nature of the unannounced visit settled over her. They hadn't come for a family reconciliation or a moment of care. They had come to execute a hostile, premeditated takeover of my life. Dr. Brennan stepped forward, adopting a practiced, patronizing bedside manner designed to demean without ever raising his voice. He pulled a small, silver-trimmed digital tablet from his leather briefcase. In a smooth, condescending tone meant for someone incapable of following a basic conversation, he announced that they were here to conduct an emergency competency evaluation. Under the pretext of safeguarding my well-being against the cognitive strains of old age, he began firing off rapid-fire orientation questions, asking for today's exact date, the current year, the names of sitting political figures, and the sequence of recent national events. Julian stood just behind the doctor, arms crossed tightly over his chest, wearing a smug, predatory smirk of absolute victory. He truly believed he had cornered a helpless, aging widow who would stutter, break down, and prove every fabricated lie he had fed to the medical board. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I look toward my daughter for validation or rescue. Instead, I stood completely straight, letting the absolute silence of the room absorb the doctor's arrogant inquiries. When Dr. Brennan finished his final question, expecting hesitation or confusion, I answered with the chilling clarity of an archivist reading from a flawless, cataloged manuscript. I didn't just give him today's date, I recited the exact astrological and historical calendar markers, moving seamlessly into a detailed breakdown of the legislative timeline governing estate trusts under Section 404 of the State Probate Code. I listed the precise legal precedents, cross-referenced historical corporate amendments from the archive files I had uncovered in Richard's jewelry box, and cited the exact statutes governing fiduciary duty. I spoke without a single pause, my voice steady, sharp, and entirely unyielding.
Dr. Brennan stopped tapping his tablet. The patronizing smile vanished instantly from his face, replaced by a sudden, creeping look of professional alarm as he realized the woman standing before him possessed a razor-sharp intellect far superior to his own staged examination. Julian's smug smirk shattered in an instant. He stumbled half a step forward, his face draining of color as he stammered an interruption, trying to salvage the narrative by claiming my clarity was merely a temporary lucid spike, masking deep-seated psychological deterioration. I turned my gaze away from the compromised psychiatrist and fixed my eyes entirely on Harrison Coleman, the elder law attorney. I didn't waste a single breath on emotional appeals or defensive sobbing. I moved with the cold, calculated precision of an investigator laying out an exhibit in a court of law. "Before you continue with this theatrical charade, counselor," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence like cold steel, "let us clear up the most vital question of jurisdiction and ethics. Exactly who is paying your exorbitant retainer for this illegal, unannounced home invasion? And is it not Julian, the man with a direct financial conflict of interest in a $107 million trust?" The effect of those words was immediate and devastating. Attorney Coleman stiffened, his professional composure cracking as his eyes darted nervously toward Julian. A lawyer of his standing knew the severe legal boundaries of forced psychiatric interventions. Participating in a staged guardianship grab without verifiable independent cause carried catastrophic disbarment risks and severe criminal liability. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a sharp click, taking a decisive step backward toward the exit. Dr. Brennan mirrored his movement, hastily stowing away his tablet, suddenly realizing they had been weaponized in a fraudulent and highly criminal conspiracy orchestrated by a desperate corporate predator. The walls Julian had spent months building around me were collapsing in a matter of seconds, leaving him standing completely exposed in front of his own hired instruments. The sudden retreat of the two hired professionals left a suffocating silence hanging in the hallway, broken only by the ragged breathing of my daughter Chloe. Julian stood frozen near the coat rack, his face draining of all color, his previous corporate arrogance instantly replaced by a frantic panic as he realized his entire house of cards was collapsing in broad daylight. I did not scream, nor did I allow a single drop of triumph to show on my face. Instead, I turned slowly away from the doorway and walked with deliberate, quiet steps down the hallway toward Richard's private study. The room smelled faintly of aged paper, leather, and cedar, the exact scent of safety and truth. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, reached past the archive boxes, and slid out a heavy manila folder that had been tightly sealed with red wax and stamped with the date of Richard's final inventory. I walked back into the living room, holding the dossier against my chest, like an old book of records carrying the weight of a final verdict. The two hired professionals Julian had brought, Dr. Brennan and Attorney Coleman, were hurrying toward their cars in the driveway, eager to distance themselves from a fraudulent setup that carried the immediate threat of disbarment. Julian tried to block their path with a desperate, stuttering plea, but they brushed past him without a single backward glance, slamming their car doors shut and speeding away down the road. Left entirely exposed, Julian turned back toward the house, his jaw twitching as he forced a weak, trembling smile, trying to salvage a shred of control over the room. "Mother, you're letting this get completely out of hand," Julian stammered, his voice losing its polished veneer as he took a cautious step forward. "We can sit down, just the two of us, and sort this out like rational adults without dragging sensitive legal matters into—" I didn't let him finish. I simply opened the heavy manila folder and let the unvarnished truth speak for itself.
Inside that folder lay a complete archive of digital transcripts, audio logs, and financial records compiled over the past 3 weeks. With the precision of a museum archivist preserving a vital manuscript, I pulled out the first item, a printed transcript paired with a miniature USB drive containing a clear, unmistakable audio recording of Julian's voice, captured over a secure phone line just 2 weeks prior. I set the papers down on the coffee table where Chloe sat staring in stunned confusion. Without hesitation, I pressed play on the small audio device I had brought from the study. The tinny, unmistakable sound of Julian's voice filled the quiet living room. On the recording, he was speaking to a corporate associate, laughing casually as he laid out the exact blueprint for my forced institutionalization. He joked about how easy it would be to manipulate an aging widow suffering from grief, detailing the timeline for declaring me legally incompetent so he could seize full control of the $107 million legacy trust without a single legal roadblock. Julian's face went completely gray. He lunged forward, his hands clawing at the air as if he could physically snatch the recorder away, but he froze halfway when he caught sight of Chloe standing directly in his path. My daughter looked as though she had been struck by lightning. The blood had entirely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin paper white as she stared at her husband with eyes wide open in sheer horror. Before Chloe could recover, I laid down the second piece of evidence, a thick stack of bank statements and encrypted email threads printed directly from an offshore server. These weren't related to my trust. They were documents Julian believed were safely buried under an alias account, records detailing secret communications with a family law attorney. As Chloe's trembling fingers picked up the pages, her eyes scanned the lines of text detailing a pre-arranged asset-stripping strategy. The emails proved Julian had never viewed Chloe as a true partner. To him, she was merely an instrument, a convenient legal conduit used to acquire family land, whose purpose would expire the moment the trust was looted. The documents explicitly outlined a confidential divorce strategy designed to abandon Chloe with nothing once her inheritance and her personal $8 million commercial parcel were transferred into his corporate holding firm. The world Chloe had built her life upon shattered into dust right before her eyes. "You planned this," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with a deep, hollow pain. She looked down at the documents bearing her husband's digital signature, then slowly raised her gaze to meet Julian's terrified eyes. Julian backed away toward the front door, his hands trembling as he tried to stammer out in incoherent denial, mumbling something about edited files and corporate stress. But there was no escape left for him. The walls of deception he had built had crumbled completely, leaving him standing naked in front of the wreckage of his own greed. The legal collapse did not take months. It arrived like a sudden storm in the dead of winter. Within just 3 weeks of that unforgettable confrontation, backed by the sharp legal mind of Arthur Pendleton and the impenetrable fortress of evidence Eleanor had quietly built, Chloe filed for a unilateral divorce. Julian tried to salvage his image, flashing that familiar, practiced smile in the hallways of the district court, but the armor he wore had cracked beyond repair. Facing severe federal charges for financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, and calculated civil manipulation of a spouse, he was finally backed into a corner. There was no charm left that could buy his way out, no slick presentation that could rewrite the paper trail. Stripped of his leverage, he was forced to sign a separation agreement that left him with literally empty hands, no assets, no alimony, and a permanent toxic stain across the investment world that would follow him forever. I watched him sign the final papers through the glass partition of the conference room, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of his ruin finally sank in. But the silence that followed in that room was not of triumph. It was the heavy, echoing quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears. And then the focus shifted away from the wreckage of the past to the fragile, aching process of putting the living back together. Chloe stood in the center of the quiet living room of our family home, the place where all of this quiet agony had begun. She looked around at the walls that had once sheltered her reckless rebellion, and the weight of her own blindness seemed to finally crush her defenses. She did not try to speak, nor did she offer any of the sharp, defensive retorts that had once come so easily to her lips. Instead, she walked slowly toward Eleanor, toward the mother who had stood in the shadows, absorbing blow after blow just to keep the roof over her daughter's head. With a soft, broken sob that tore straight through the quiet air, Chloe dropped heavily to her knees, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept with the unfiltered grief of a child who had nearly lost everything. "I was so blind, Mom," Chloe choked out, her voice raw and cracked, the arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only raw, bleeding truth. "You protected us from a monster, and I handed the knife right to him. I am so, so sorry." Eleanor didn't offer a grand speech or a triumphant lecture. She simply closed her eyes, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she rested them gently on her daughter's head, running her fingers through Chloe's hair with a quiet, fierce grace that spoke louder than any words ever could. It was the forgiveness of a mother who had walked through fire and would do it again 1,000 times over just to pull her child back to safety. In the weeks that followed, that tearful moment on the living room floor became the anchor for an entirely new beginning. Healing, we quickly learned, is not a sudden epiphany. It is a slow, daily choice to rebuild from the ash. For Chloe, redemption could not simply be spoken, it had to be walked, step by agonizing step. She needed to look her own past in the eye and transform her deepest trauma into a shield for others. To find her true self again and pay back the debt of her recovery, she made a life-altering decision. She formally withdrew her applications from the high-flying corporate programs that Julian had once pushed her toward, and instead, she submitted her enrollment for a master's degree in social work. Her goal was clear, sharp, and deeply personal. She wanted to specialize in supporting victims of financial abuse and psychological manipulation, helping women like her who had been slowly erased by charming predators behind closed doors. When she received her acceptance letter, she didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. She drove straight to her mother's house, placed the envelope quietly on the kitchen table, and sat down with a steady, peaceful look in her eyes that I hadn't seen since the day this nightmare began. The story of our lives did not magically become a fairy tale. The scars of financial betrayal, broken trust, and the months of silent terror do not simply vanish because a court signed a piece of paper. But sitting here behind this microphone, watching the way a family can stitch itself back together with pure, unyielding love and accountability, I am reminded of why we tell these stories. Some storms do not just pass through, they strip away everything false, leaving behind only the people who were strong enough to stay when the roof caved in. 6 months had slipped quietly past the heavy mahogany doors of our home, smoothing down the jagged edges of the past, like river water over smooth stones. Autumn had settled over the valley, painting the estate in deep shades of amber and gold, and nowhere was that quiet transformation more visible than in Richard's beloved rose garden. The bushes he had pruned and tended for decades were now bursting with thick, velvety blooms, their petals heavy with morning dew, thriving under the careful, steady hands that now tended them. The financial storm that had once threatened to sweep our entire legacy away had long since cleared. With the steady guidance of a brilliant, ethical financial advisor recommended by Arthur Pendleton, I had taken full, unshakable control of the family trust. No corporate snakes, no secret aliases, and no boardroom predators could ever touch it again. Instead of sitting idle, the trust was now actively funding community preservation projects and local history education programs, the exact causes Richard had always cherished in his quietest, most generous moments. Standing on the back terrace with a cup of warm tea in my hands, I watched the sunlight filter through the tall maple trees and spill across the sprawling lawn. Down by the stone fountain, 4-year-old Emma, Chloe's bright-eyed little girl, was running barefoot across the emerald grass, her high-pitched laughter echoing sweetly in the crisp air as she chased a cluster of yellow butterflies. Just a few feet away, Chloe sat on a wrought iron bench, sketching in a notebook with a relaxed, effortless grace that had been entirely foreign to her just months ago. The heavy, mechanical tension that Julian had stitched into her spirit was gone, replaced by a radiant, grounded independence. When she looked up and caught my eye, she didn't offer a forced corporate smile or a nervous nod. She simply smiled back, a genuine, deep smile that reached all the way to her eyes, signaling a soul that had finally reclaimed its own voice. Later that afternoon, after Emma had drifted off to sleep and the house had settled into a peaceful hush, I walked back into Richard's private study. The room smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and cedar, just as it always had. Resting on the center of the desk was a leather-bound journal containing the final entries Richard had written before his passing, notes filled with quiet wisdom, gentle reminders, and his eternal belief in the strength of our family. As I opened the cover and ran my fingers over his familiar handwriting, a profound realization washed over me. For the longest time, I had believed that our true legacy was locked inside the numbers, the $107 million, the commercial parcels, the title deeds, and the corporate vaults. But holding that pen, looking out through the study window at the brilliant autumn garden, I finally understood how wrong I had been. The greatest inheritance Richard left behind was never measured in currency. It was measured in courage. It lived in the wisdom to see through deception, the self-respect to refuse a gilded cage, and the unyielding right of every woman to stand tall and claim her own life, no matter how late the hour or how deep the shadows. I gently closed the journal, picked up my phone from the corner of the desk, and opened the airline confirmation page I had left bookmarked for 3 days. The screen glowed softly in the dim light of the study, displaying a one-way ticket bearing a name I had waited decades to fully step into. Next Tuesday, the flight would depart for Dublin, carrying me across the Atlantic toward the rugged, mist-veiled green hills of Ireland, a journey I had dreamed of taking with Richard 50 years ago, postponed by duty, children, and the endless demands of building an empire. Now the children were safe, the debt of the past was settled, and the horizon belonged entirely to me. As I locked the study door behind me one last time and walked out into the warm, golden light of the fading evening, I knew the story of the Vance family was far from over, but for the very first time in my life, I wasn't guarding someone else's fortress. I was simply walking forward into my own absolute, breathtaking freedom.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.